My guest today does something rare. He explores fringe ideas about consciousness and the nature of reality while keeping one foot firmly planted in the practical world. Tom Morgan is a former financial analyst who rates his ideas on a woo scale because he knows that his readers, many of whom also come from the financial world, will run for the hills as soon as something sounds too mystical or ungrounded. But at the same time, Tom speaks to an audience of people who are smart enough and accomplished enough to have realized that maybe there's something more going on in the world than what we've been led to believe. I've been enjoying Tom's podcast and newsletter called The Leading Edge, and I wanted to invite him in because he does this rare balancing act. He's exploring ideas that unfortunately often come packaged with what I would call ultra-spiritual and nonsensical beliefs, and he's approaching these ideas with more discernment. To not just talk about crystals or Atlantis or ancient aliens or something like that, but to extract useful, practical knowledge out of ancient ideas. So today we talk about what Tom calls the most important idea in the world. You'll discover what happened to him when he started to treat reality as responsive and benevolent rather than harsh and uncaring. We discuss why the biggest breakthroughs in life are often associated with the biggest fears and most resistance, and you'll get some really practical and testable ideas on how to navigate life even if you feel like you have no idea where to go next. Neither Tom nor I are here to try to convince you of any of these ideas. This is just a curiosity-first conversation about things and ideas that are worth exploring, even if they're on the fringe. And one more note, this conversation is full of references and resources, and I've compiled all of them in the links in the show notes. So check out the links below. There you can sign up for my newsletter to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes, and you can find all of the resources mentioned in this conversation. So without further ado, here's Tom Morgan from The Leading Edge. All right, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
It's my pleasure, Shane. Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, you recently wrote an article where you propose the most important idea in the world, or at least the most important idea for our modern times, to be that of non-local consciousness. And I want to dive straight into that, really. Maybe one thing worth mentioning is you give your articles a woo rating. You rate things. How woo is this? And this is really something I have to say that really works for me, because I also have some, I hesitate about things that are very woo.
Yeah, it's I get a lot of positive feedback on it, but I think you have the problem is that a lot of what's important is often fringe. We're typically wrong about at least 50% of reality at any one time. So if you don't hold any fringe views, you're wrong, right? Like if you just believe everything you were taught at school, you are at best very incomplete, and you are at worst really wrong about some big things. So like if you get that first premise out of the way, you have to believe some things that are not consensus. But at the same time, like most of those things are like quasi-spiritual by definition, like they're about the nature of reality. And some of the things that spiritual people believe are like so crazily out there. I'm not saying they're not true, but if you just have to have some level of discernment to be like, okay, there's actually a decent amount of interesting like argumentation for the sun being conscious. But if you go out there and just say the sun's conscious, guys, and you don't label it as like a 9 out of 10 woo rating, I think people just kind of shut down. And 50% of my audience, at least, is finance people. So they haven't really been exposed to like any of these ideas. So if you just go in cold talking about crystals and Atlantis and the flat earth or whatever nonsense that some people believe, right, you're just going to alienate your audience. And so I think you have to have that meta awareness of what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Often ideas such as, we're going to talk about non-local consciousness, are mixed into this whole cauldron that also contains conspiracy theories about aliens and crystals and all this kind of stuff. And then it's so easy to then just reject the whole thing. And so right away, I think you're doing brave work by trying to dissect this, by trying to pick out what actually makes any sense and what is actually useful out of all this mess. So thank you for doing that. With that said, first of all, is it fair of me to say that you've stated this is the most important idea, is the idea of non-local consciousness?
I think so. For background, I had an experience in 2017, which was a direct experience which hinted at this idea. And then I've spent the subsequent 8 years researching it, most of which I felt like I was crazy. And I mean, for 2 of those years, I was actually crazy, so that's fine. But it's something that really really, really specifically breaks the materialist paradigm. And as a result, there's an enormous amount of entrenched individual and institutional opposition to it. And I wrote recently in a piece, which I think you're referencing, that one of my big questions has been, cool, is this thing becoming more mainstream? And I was actually writing an article about that. And I mentioned, Jeremy Renner, the Marvel Hawkeye guy, having a near-death experience recently. There's been a bunch of people who are near-death experience researchers go on reasonably mainstream podcasts like Tim Ferriss, but it was all still something that I didn't feel was coming into the public consciousness. And then my wife texted me as I was writing this article, and she's a national anchor for an American news station. She was saying, Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, is on my show right now talking about his new book, The Secret of Secrets. I think you'll be interested. She had no idea what I was working on, and I Googled it, and The Secret of Secrets, this is in the description, I'm not spoiling the book, but The Secret of Secrets in Secret of Secrets is that consciousness is non-local. And it's now #1 New York Times bestseller. It's in, the end of every bookshelf in every airport in the world. And I'm like, okay, this is the start of the mainstreaming of the view. Unless anyone think that Dan Brown is, like a trashy fiction writer, it's based on 8 years of research. And I've been into this research for 10 years, also as like a normal person. And the anecdotes he picks and the studies he picks are very, very strong ones. Would you like me to go into why I think it's so important?
First, yes. So thank you for that context. But first, let's go, what exactly do you mean by this?
The answer is I'm not even sure.
Okay.
So the best I think I can do is use technology as an analogy.
Okay.
So look at information. We know that the internet is in our device, but we also know the whole internet is not in our device. If our iPhone breaks, the internet does not cease to exist, right? And so it is both in our device and everywhere at the same time. And I think that one helpful way of thinking about consciousness is in that way, that basically we can access some form of collective consciousness. And when we do, we have access to more information than we do with just the pound of meat or whatever it is in our head. And I think in that framing, for most of our lives, we've been told that the brain produces consciousness, and therefore when the brain dies, there will be no more of it for us. Whereas I have now come to believe the brain is more of a receiver for consciousness, in the same way that you don't actually believe that Taylor Swift is in your radio. You believe your radio is receiving Taylor Swift.
Yes, that's great. So it is, to maybe borrow another analogy, it's kind of the idea that the drop is part of the ocean, and even if there's a momentary experience of the drop being separate, it's just a part of the whole somehow. So that the individual's experience of I am a conscious individual, like isolated from everything else, is kind of a spike in the wave or something like that, rather than I'm actually isolated and individual and alone over here.
I recently encountered the work of a guy called Tim Freak. His work is exceptional. Really, really interesting. Some of the most interesting new work I've encountered. One of the things he talks about is the emergence of what he calls the Unividual, which is someone who understands that they are both an individual and part of the universal whole. And that is fundamentally a paradox, but it is the fundamental paradox that defines us. A lot of people in the non-dual traditions are like, your ego needs to be dissolved into oneness. Right? The end goal is to dissolve your individual agency into oneness. And Tim says, we didn't spend the last however many billion years evolving an increasingly sophisticated conscious and agentic self as a mistake. That it's this deliberate thing where we hold this increasingly differentiated, wise, agentic self against the whole universe. And it is the universe witnessing itself. So yes, it all is one, but also you are a separate individual. I know we've already gone into philosophical quite quickly, but I think it's really important that a lot of people listen to this and they're like, well, obviously I'm therefore nothing as I'm just a receiver for consciousness. It's like, no, I think you can have this viewpoint and retain a really strong sense of individuality. What happens to that sense of individuality when you die, I think is mega interesting and maybe worth discussion later on. When you go back into the ocean, do you just become the ocean? There's lots of different viewpoints on that. But the fact is that if you can hold the paradox of I am an individual and I am part of the whole, that's, I think, at the beginning of this paradigm shift.
Yeah. That's also something I've observed where there is almost like we want to escape from the ego, or we want to escape from the individual. It can be a bit overwhelming to be an individual alive on Earth. And so, of course, we want to get away from it. And I think sometimes that is how things like, okay, you meditate long enough, you'll be free from this from this problem. So I love that you're framing this in a different way. That does make sense to me. I guess we're getting to, okay, why is this important? So part of this could be, it's like philosophically interesting. But yeah, what are the implications, do you think? What do I make of this as a, average person living an average life?
I think it changes everything. I genuinely do. Dan Brown's central conclusion from his 8 years was, I no longer fear death. For the last few months, I've been really drawn to this idea of initiation rituals. That basically a lot of the secret societies like Eleusis or the Knights Templar or, the elites would be taken into a situation where through maybe psychedelics, maybe through acoustic harmony, maybe through some other weird thing, they would have an out-of-body experience where they would suddenly have a shift in their perspective, where they were like, okay, I am this body, but I am also part of a larger consciousness. And therefore, when this body dies, I will not cease to exist. And that frame shift, which I think is in some degree possible just by understanding that is true. I don't know whether we all have to go in and have these crazy esoteric initiations, but suddenly that shifts everything. That it basically says material stuff is good. Material stuff makes us comfortable, but the purpose of life is not the material stuff, as I think we all intrinsically know. But then what is it? Oh, it's the evolution of consciousness. And I can go into more about what I mean by that, but I think so much human behavior, and the worst human behavior, comes from this real unconscious fear of death. One of the things Brown says in his book, which is new to me, but he basically says that immediate fear of death, fight or flight, drip, 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 drip fear of death through the news media, through our materialist paradigm, it creates selfishness. So I get mine because there's really no point to all of this. So I should hoard as many resources as I can before I die, because that's all the point is. Whereas if you flip that and be like, oh, it's actually about the evolution of consciousness, without denying the value of the material or material success, you start to flip things. And I think that all the most psychopathic traits that we see in tech and finance would start to diminish. And I think people would just be more relaxed. I think people would just feel better about life. And it spins into all these other worldviews that have really, really, really helped me, like Earth School, which I guess we can talk about in a bit. But I just think it does an enormous amount to diminish the impact of like the worst kinds of materialism.
Yeah. Interesting. So I have a perspective on this. I recently made a video about sex, death, and money as the three things that I feel like pretty much everybody has a complicated relationship with these three things to some extent, and they're so potent, and so healing one's relationship with sex, death, and money is incredibly potent. And for me, death has been one of those things where I feel very lucky that early on in my life, I was obsessed with martial arts, and I was exposed to writing from warrior cultures, basically, where of course they have death is a big thing to think about and contemplate when your whole job is to go to war. It's one of those things where everybody, whether it's a samurai or a Viking or whoever, whatever, from a warrior culture, they have to be at peace with the idea that I could die, and I could die soon. And what does that mean? And you cannot, whatever the answer is, you can't run away from it. You can't tell yourself, no, I'm going to be fine. Right? You can't be in denial of it. And I have definitely found that it's extremely liberating to really come to terms with death, to come to terms with this is going to end. And like you said, it comes with a sense of peace. It comes with a sense of maybe less grasping, less rating the wrong things. But then I wonder, if we assume that consciousness survives death, doesn't that take actually some of them, isn't that counterproductive in that sense? Assuming that I have one go has some really interesting implications, and being at peace with the idea of this is the one go I get. That seems to be where I got a lot of growth and peace. And now if you tell me, oh no, you keep going, does that undo something? I don't know. I'm thinking in real time here. I don't know what the answer is, but what do you make of that?
Well, I think the answer is it's really complicated. Like I told this to my wife. My wife was like, you realize if everyone believed that, there'd just be this huge raft of suicides. where the people that were having like really, really tough, like inexplicably difficult existences would kill themselves because they're like, okay, cool, we're good. Like if I really genuinely believed I would reincarnate, I would just kill myself because like, well, that was too tough for me, and I'm going to go back and get a different assignment. And yeah, maybe she's right, or maybe like the preciousness of this life does get diminished by thinking that we come back, relatively infinitely. But you're never going to be you again.
Yeah.
Like I'm never going to have my son again, and in these circumstances, and I that allows me to have the preciousness while also taking, there is this lovely idea that the same soul family gathers around you in each incarnation. So like my son may be my wife in the next incarnation, or maybe my best friend or something, and they keep popping back into your field to keep you company along the way. So even though I live in mortal fear of losing the companionship of my family, maybe it's not the last time I'm going to hang out with them. I think that there's this trope of like memento mori, like fear of death, right? Like live every day like it's your last. No one does that. Like it's just a completely unrealistic standard where it's like, yeah, cool. Like, what are you gonna do? Go skydiving every day? Like, you're gonna hold down a job? Like, sure, maybe the understanding of the ephemerality of life is helpful, and I think it is helpful, but it doesn't help you understand how to spend your life. And I've come very much down in a lot of different directions, but I would say it's definitely 9 or 10 out of 10 on the Wu rating. But I think the idea of, all right, let's take this on a step. There is a surprisingly large amount of empirical evidence for reincarnation and near-death experiences, which is one of those things that if someone had told me before I went into this like 2 to 3 years ago, I would have just assumed was like complete nonsense. I would be like, well, if there was evidence for this, we would have seen it. Well, go and look at Ian Stevenson's work at UVA, for example. Like, go and look at Bruce Grayson's work on near-death experiences, right? These are not things that are easily dismissed at all. So first off, like, we have evidence for reincarnation, whether or not you choose to believe it. So then the answer is why? So why you reincarnate? Why? Like, what's the purpose? And I think the answer is complexification, which is a bit of a dry scientific, concept that we can talk about. But ultimately, it's to evolve your consciousness in a certain direction towards integration over a series of successive lifetimes. And so one of the metaphysical views I like, because it might be true, is the idea of soul lessons, where Shane and Tom decide, which parents they're going to incarnate into as a child, where they're going to be, what they're going to do, and then they'll have a curriculum set for them. And just because they have a curriculum set for them doesn't mean that they're going to pass it. It's just there are going to be a series of lessons and learnings for them over the course of that life. And that is to evolve them, or to correct mistakes or misperceptions they had in prior lives. And so even though entropy wins over the scale of an individual lifetime, you have this much longer arc, which basically takes the soul that you have through this evolutionary process of becoming more and more differentiated and more integrated into the whole. That fits like a lot of contemporary complexity science, but it also means, cool, what does that mean? How do I spend my day? I think it means doing what you love in service of love, finding a way to do something super differentiated to you while also keeping it integrated into the whole. And people that do that, in my experience, have very, 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 very fun lives.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there that, first of all, the near-death experiences thing, I think is a great example of something where we have, there's so much evidence, and it's really a question of first of all, do you want to pay attention to it? Because if it's uncomfortable, then you're probably just going to be like, I'm just not going to go there. But it's definitely something is going on there. Like, it happens so often, in aggregate, it happens so often that people come back from the brink of death telling more or less the same story, right? And it definitely seems to suggest something's going on there. And of course, it's also possible to, in a state of deep meditation or during an ecstatic drum dance or breath work or taking plant medicine or whatever, there's so many ways in which you can have this experience that you mentioned before of kind of leaving this normal state of consciousness, seeing something vastly expanded and seeing like, okay, there must be more going on here. But actually something I really admire about the nature of reality that we live in is that there's always a way out. Like, if you don't want to believe this stuff, you can always say, oh, it's just stuff that's happening in the brain. people have these experiences, these near-death experiences. They're telling these stories based on the cultural conditioning. There's always an exit door, right? If you want to live in a world without magic, you can, which is something that I find actually quite impressive about the reality we live in.
There's two things, right? One of the points that Brown makes in his book, which I think is subtly profound, which is that paradigms don't shift with proof. But basically, like, everyone's like, where's the proof? I'm like, well, here's 100,000 studies. And they're like, cool. Paradigms don't shift with proof. Paradigms shift when there are so many anomalies that the system eventually breaks under the pressure of all the anomalies. And I don't know how long that takes or whether we're even close for us, but it's like, okay, reincarnation, psychic abilities, non-local phenomena of consciousness, maybe even like entities of contact with like entities of some kind, just broad mysticism in general, non-dual states, what people see under the influence of psychedelics. You can just list off near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Like, you can list off all of these anomalies, which are all excluded by the materialist paradigm, but all immediately included by the non-local paradigm. And it doesn't mean the non-local paradigm is right, but it means that it might be. And I think that's worth considering. But there's also something else I think about, to your point, which is that if you believe we're here to learn, if you constantly had the illusion broken, then you wouldn't learn, right? That if I feel like I constantly forget the way that I've actually believed that reality works, but only so that it helps create the sense of realism for me to believe that I can learn a lesson in this life. That I'm like, okay, cool, maybe death is not real, but like, I'm going to be really careful when I'm crossing the road. It's like, I think we genuinely keep forgetting so that this reality serves its purpose for us.
Yeah. Well, I have kind of a pet theory that as a collective, we went through a long age of forgetting. Because a lot of these things that we're talking about, like if we're talking to, let's say, the average person in a Western culture, then a lot of this stuff seems a bit woo, seems very not mainstream, right? It's not the cultural idea. But go a few generations back, or maybe in this case, maybe dozens to hundreds of generations back, and probably our ancestors were animist. They were probably living in a world of spirit and magic, and they probably had some sense of, life after death or something like that. It would have been much less controversial. It's almost like collectively we plunged ourselves into this age of forgetting and really rejecting all of the magical stuff. And I think that this may be also a response to, we kind of went from spiritual as a tribal thing to institutionalized religion to the kind of power bloat of institutionalized religion and a warring of institutionalized religions against each other, which became super dangerous. And the whole thing also got distorted. The moment you have people like, running crusades and wars and so on in the name of a loving God, something has gone wrong, right? And I feel like a lot of the Enlightenment and a lot of this material scientific thinking is a counterbalance to that. We cannot let that happen again. So it's a strong rejection of this kind of thinking that also led to incredible technological advances and civilizational growth. And maybe now it's time, because I think there's also a trend of people becoming post-rationalist, right? Where it's like you went through a phase of being ultra-rational, then you realize, somehow this is not working, or there's limits to this, and then you come into something spiritual. But it's different to become spiritual after having engaged with the material world and having developed rational and logic than before.
And I think that's it. I think there's two ways that people look at this. I think they look at this, the Western world, and they're like, oof, that was a mistake. We left our indigenous and tribal and magical heritage, and it's a mistake, and as a result, we're destroying the world. And I think that is a partial truth. But I've come to understand, like, everything is like holarchies, not hierarchies. I think that's how reality exists. And one of the members of my community really helped me understand spiral dynamics, which is like a model of
Ken Wilber?
development. Ken Wilber's integral, I think.
Oh, right.
and spiral is, but they're all kind of the same.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know a lot about this, but all like what I take away from this is that like we're like a rainbow onion, and at the middle of the rainbow onion is like our basic needs, and like if we miss a bunch of meals or like miss a bunch of night sleep, we'll revert back to that level. But then after that, we go to like a tribal identity or to like our close family, and then we go a little bit more complex to like a dogmatic, tyrannical or orthodox religious culture, where it's like we do this stuff as a group because it's this due to this big control structure. And then you transcend that and you go to like a much more individualist nature where it's like, I am going to succeed off the back of my own gifts and abilities. Science is true, rationality is true. It's all about materialism getting what's yours. And then you transcend that to this view where like actually everyone's equal, every idea is equally valid. That's called the green stage. And then you transcend beyond that and you're like, well, actually, that's just a perspective. And all of these different perspectives have different merits. But at one point, there's a frame break. And that frame break is where we are right now, which is understanding that there's a force making your onion evolve. And everyone, they claim, goes through roughly the same stages. And having spoke to more than 2,000 people, most people do go through these stages where they start off as an infant, then they go into teenagerhood where things get like reasonably tribal, then they go into like the order place where typically they had some sort of orthodox religion in their lives, then they go through like their 20s and early 30s, which is super like aggressive achievement oriented, and then they're like, well, that was incredibly stupid, and they kind of reject that, often for like a spiritual bypassing stage. And then there's this frame break, and the frame break is, I think, what we're going through as a culture, which is like there's something driving this process. There's something driving this process of the evolution of consciousness, and I can harmonize with it. The latter stage, so there's yellow where people understand how the system works, but they're still trying to control the system through like really complex like tools and white papers and stuff. And then there's the turquoise, or I think teal is what it's called, which is like, okay, the system's evolving in a certain way, and I can harmonize with that system. I can harmonize with that force, and that harmonization is very energetic. It's Taoist. It's like a black belt being perfectly attuned to the environment, and that's typically one step. You move one step, you attune to the field. You move another step, you attune to the field, and that's the form of leader that's emerging right now, and it's the form of human that's emerging right now. But they can only emerge because they have really high levels of agency and they understand science and they understand materialism, and they don't reject those things because they understand that they themselves include that stage. So I see where we are right now, as long as we don't screw this up and destroy the earth in the interim, as a really, really positive stage of human development, because it's natural. It's where we've always gone.
One thing I want to point out about what you just said, I love this model of development because I feel like there's a useful indicator in there. You can say, as I'm evolving, as I'm changing my perspective, is it including the previous stage or not? Because I think that often we can get stuck when we're moving laterally, where you could say, okay, maybe whatever, I was politically left-leaning before, and now I'm politically right-leaning. That's a change, but somehow I'm just moving back and forth between two positions. It's not the same as actual growth, where suddenly it's like, oh, I can see the whole field I was constricted to before. That is a really useful model to check in with yourself. Am I growing or not? And the reason I bring this up, like this has been a concern for me, like I'm really interested in growth, and I'm interested in not deluding myself, especially when it comes to something like this, where it's like, okay, why am I starting to believe stuff that the former version of me would have rejected, maybe for good reasons? How can I make sure that I'm not just spiraling into some kind of delusion, right?
Yeah, I love this expression, contrarian delusion. And I think that it's really important to work out which direction in the onion you're going. I see a lot of people to like the orange stage or the green stage, like they get post-achievement and they're like, all we need to do is to go back to like an indigenous way of life, right? A lot of that can be based on like magical thinking or like really crazy ethical beliefs, right? Like we're not going back to sacrificing 100,000 people at a feast day in like Aztec Mexico, right? We're just not going to do that. We can actually hopefully synthesize all the gifts of modern science with a lot of the magical thinking of the shamanic era, which a lot of it's true. A lot of it got rejected by science and modernity, but nothing ever goes backwards. And I think that like Tim Freak makes the point that like even the Taoists like 3,000 years ago were saying that the Taoists 3,000 years before them were the only guys that really understood it. And my bias is that like if any of the religious or thought systems that we previously have were going to save the world, they would have already done it. You know, like all the Christians or the Buddhists or the Hindus, I think a lot of the more fundamentalists are like, you know, all you guys all need to do is just adopt our worldview and everything will be great. And I'm like, well, how's that going? Like, I'm not saying that there isn't value in each of these worldviews, immense value when they're synthesized, but nothing ever goes backwards, and whatever is emerging is always entirely new. And I'm very, very optimistic about the post-scientific worldview that's emerging right now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same idea, right? It's kind of a fearful retraction. Oh, things are uncomfortable. Let's go back to how it was before. Because especially if that before is from a time before I was alive, I can always imagine how great it was. And there's, it's easy to maintain that illusion, right? But it's exactly that. It's like if we find our way collectively back into more of an animist worldview, back into more of a spiritual way of being, or whatever it is, getting there on the other side of all this rationalism is totally different from rolling back time and getting to it before we had all this. And that might be the very point of what we're experiencing.
The spiral expert that I interviewed the other day, he made this brilliant analogy that I can't stop thinking about. I'm not sure whether it was his, but he certainly referenced it, which is at times of pressure, it's like squeezing the middle of a balloon, where you have a whole bunch of people that regress and you have a whole bunch of people that break through at the top. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. If you look at any major stress event, like say the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and you watch online, there's a whole bunch of people that regress down into this really, really aggressive fear stage of like, we need a strong leader, or we need to kill the other side, or whatever it is, right? And you see a much smaller group, because they're typically not on social media, but be like, okay, that's another data point for us needing to transcend our differences, well, us needing to develop a new system, us to be able to move beyond binary tribal politics. Like, and obviously the systems that we're in, as we all know, optimize for the former viewpoint and not the latter. But that still makes me optimistic that there's a largely unseen and less vocal majority that are breaking through at the top every time there's pressure on the system.
That's such a good point. I also think that to that end, the rise of AI slop content might be such a force that pushes us towards, because like we have this old system that incentivizes this tribalization, incentivizes essentially, right? It's good for any ad-driven platform if people are having a mud fight in the comments section of whatever is being posted, right? That's great engagement. It's getting out of hand, and I think that the coming tidal wave of AI slop might actually like push us over the edge, where it's just like, well, this system cannot function anymore, and something new has to emerge.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with that. I'm not sure how that works, because the centralization mechanisms for that are the same mechanisms that are destroying us. I run a private community of 150 humans, right? So like Shane's curiosity enhances my curiosity, particularly if I know Shane's interested in something that I'm interested in. That's how social media really used to work. Even a few years ago, that was how Twitter worked for me. It was very good at surfacing people for whom I had resonance with, and Substack maybe is doing that and maybe isn't. But tangentially, I countered an idea through Tim Freak a couple of weeks ago that for me was like kind of both familiar and new, which is that the realization of non-local consciousness will be facilitated by understanding of cloud computing. That like emerging technology is an analogy for the structure of deep reality. And he makes the comparison between AI and the structure of deep reality. That what AI does is it takes all the digital information on the internet, words and pictures, and it remixes it. So that everything that AI produces probably is completely novel. That combination of words has never been produced before. That combination of images has never been produced before. We are the prompt for that, but it's basically perpetually remixing the past to create novelty. And Tim Freak says that's how reality works. That's what the process of evolution is, where it's basically constantly taking the past and it's remixing it with novelty. And the more efficiently we can do that as individuals, where we create something hyper differentiated and hyper integrated, that's when things start to go really well for us, because we hit the very limits of that evolutionary curve ourselves, where we're at the border between order and chaos. So AI, the positive angle of AI I'd never thought of is that AI is actually holding up a mirror to the nature of deeper reality. Now, if you lock yourself in the AI system and only use the AI system, it's like a black mirror. But if we use AI to understand what we're actually supposed to be doing with our lives, that for me is much more powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And it's also this technology also, it always helps us understand reality at a deeper level. I think historically, there's always the tendency that we describe the most, like the things we least understand, such as the nature of consciousness or how the human brain works or something like that. We always describe it in terms of whatever the most advanced technology of the time is, right? And in that sense, the technology changing and updating and people getting more familiar with new forms of technology upgrades our thinking about the world. That's quite interesting to consider, yeah.
I think a lot of people have it the wrong way round, which is they think the world is a simulation or the world is a video game. And I'm like, no. Like, video games work because they mimic the world. They're like, if you look at the structure of any good role-playing game, like when you kill bosses, you get power-ups, which is how I think our relationship with fears works. That, like when we conquer our fears, we get more powerful. That when we explore the map, we find treasure, right? That like we ourselves level up over the course of our life, where we have side quests and we have the main quest. Like, I think that really good role-playing games mimic the structure of deep reality, which makes them very addictive, but then they're closed systems. So we don't actually evolve to any meaningful extent within those systems. But that's what technology does, is that the best technology, or at least the most addictive technology, mimics structures that actually exist in deep reality. I don't believe that life is a simulation for that reason.
I've often thought that, as a former gamer, I've often thought about this, how we are so drawn to this experience. It's almost like it gives us what we can get by engaging with reality, but on a tighter loop, I guess, right? We have a tighter feedback loop of, I can see my high score go up. But at the same time, it also has the downside of like, okay, well, I got loads of points in this video game, but it's not nearly as rewarding as getting the points, if you will, in real life, right? Like leveling up me, the character, like leveling up my skills as a human being is so much more rewarding than leveling up a video game character. But somehow we get so hooked on this, and maybe it's like an element of certainty, or it's the how fast the feedback loop is or something. But I agree, like that what makes it interesting is that it gives us this simulacrum of really what we want to do in real life, right?
I think part of the reason why video games have this certainty, aside from the obvious of like you don't die in real life, is that the rules are always very clearly defined.
Yeah.
And I think what's going to happen, one of the biggest changes in my life in a deeply tangible and practical way, my increasing belief that the reality that I inhabit is relational. That my conscious actions in the world have a relational impact with the reality that I inhabit, which I imagine people are like, yeah, no shit. But like, a reality is actually signaling back to me. The reality is providing me with lessons. When I realize that they're a lesson and I pass the test, something goes well in my life, and my life gets a little easier, a little more fun, and the synchronicities start to flow. And like, how else would reality show you that it is interacting with you other than a meaningful coincidence? Reality signaling back to you that you're going in the right direction, that you're on the right path in the game, whatever it is, right? Again, I don't like using game because I think life is a lot more serious than a game, but just to make that analogy clearer. So I think that one of the things that you can do that genuinely has a profoundly positive impact on your life is to work out what the message is. I don't subscribe to the everything happens for a reason spiritual view. I subscribe to the everything happens for a reason, and it's your job to find out what the reason is. Right? You need to work out what the lesson you're being taught is. And when you are, the universe almost immediately presents you with an opportunity to prove that you've learnt it. Like, oh, you think you've understood that? Okay, well, here's a test. And then when you pass that test, you move on to the next level. I appreciate this is not how most people's perception of reality works, and maybe it's still not how it actually does work, but it's made me unbelievably resilient to adversity, that I haven't had any real adversity yet. But when I do have adversity, I tend to brush it off almost immediately, because I'm like, well, that didn't work out. I'll find out later why. Right? Like, oh, I didn't get that deal I was hoping for. Oh, this person like ended up screwing me over. Why? If I can't work out the reason immediately, I'm pretty sure I will later. And that just really takes the pressure off, because you're like, anything bad that happens, you understand that it's part of a broader pattern that actually is a broader pattern, rather than that you have some degree of agency and relationship with, rather than just being a slave to fate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is something I'd love to get into because, so first of all, like the idea of synchronicities is something that I've also just heard more and more people talk about that I wouldn't have expected. Like I think there's also a mainstreaming of this idea, perhaps, and it is also something that just it goes into the practical implication, right? Okay, if this is true, and we live in this responsive reality, let's say, what are the practical implications? And one of the things you just said, I mean, I have found this to be so true over and over again, that it's exactly that's like I learn the lesson and immediately a test follows. And the test from a certain perspective is really hard. So it might be the nature of like, I seem to get everything I ever wanted and then it gets taken away from me. And then it's like, how do you respond, right? Which from a certain perspective is like, well, that's terrible. Why is this happening to me? Life is unfair and so on. But if I can stay, because it's basically a pattern of, okay, this is exactly where I would have fallen into a certain behavior pattern in the past. I've learned a lesson about this. Now here's my chance to not fall into that pattern. And as soon as I let go, as soon as I decide I'm not going to do what I used to do, it's like instant liberation, right? It's like and that's where actually the feedback loop from reality is about the same speed as that from a video game, actually, right? When you pay attention to it. And this kind of thing happens to me in a way where I'm like, trying to just say this is random chance is really a stretch.
Well, that's part of the game, right? Like it's until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's one of my Carl Jung quotes, right? Like, so what does he mean by that? Until you realize that you have this direct relationship with the reality that you're inhabiting, everything will just seem like a random event and often a highly vindictive one. To give you an example, like when I went through a very, very, very difficult period of depression and midlife crisis. And during that time, I kept desperately trying to find new jobs. So I tried to be a hospice worker, a social worker, a Jungian analyst, a recruiter, all these different things. And they were terrible. I hated them. And they would often blow up, that something would go wrong with that job that would force me out of it. I would get fired from it, or the bit that I was wanting was taken away from it. And it felt like a real vindictiveness. It felt like the universe was very firmly stacked against me. But then if I look back and I'd be like, well, if I got any of those jobs, or if I had somehow managed to stick with them, I would have been incredibly unhappy. And actually, when I just started writing about the things that were so meaningful to me, I immediately got offered a very well-paid job to just do that to the finance audience that I used to write for. Like it was nuts. And then when I eventually left another job, they offered me lots more money to do something that ultimately I didn't really want to do. For me, it was like a very, very obvious test, but it was a lot of money. And I said no. And that week I got a really, really, really big like breakthrough moment in my life. And I see this all the time with other people, where it's like once you understand that there's a relationality that manifests through synchronicity, your progress accelerates. But also, like, if this is a school, what happens in school is you learn the material and then you go into an exam room. And the exam room is difficult and you can fail it. And like, arguably, there's a compassionate aspect of life that you get as many shots as you want, but it does get harder and harder the more you willfully, like, one of my favorite expressions is God shouts to us in our pains. That basically, like, the more oblivious you are to the interactivity of life, the more painful things are going to get, until finally it's right there in front of your face, getting your attention.
And there are stories of people who essentially achieve enlightenment through pure suffering. And I think that's the extreme end of that, right? If you just resist and resist and resist, it gets so bad. And I believe Eckhart Tolle is one of those people who's just like such extreme suffering with absolutely no attempt in a way to do anything about it until he just broke through. That's very unpleasant. I don't want to achieve enlightenment through pure suffering, right? But I do also have this experience where the shouting gets louder and louder. I had an experience of I started the business during COVID, or basically I started the business and then COVID hit. And immediately, the way I would interpret that now is like, oh, this is a pretty big sign that says maybe I shouldn't do this. Because immediately it was hugely obstructing to what I wanted to do, the fact that we had COVID. But at the time, I thought, no, I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to try and force it. And it just got worse and worse and worse. The stuff that kept going wrong, the obstacles that kept coming up on my path got worse and worse and worse until I ended up in, which is, completely quote unquote unrelated. I ended up in the worst accident of my life, where I broke my scapula and had like a lot of, just a lot of damage over my body. And again, this is like a coincidence, which is just yet another signal. Do not continue. It's basically the world shouting at me, do not continue on this path.
You can't do that with a materialist worldview, right? That's the difference, is that is the nature of faith, in my opinion. That faith, for most of my life, I thought faith was propositional knowledge. If you do not believe that this man was crucified and was resurrected, 2,000 years ago, you're going to hell. I have to force you to believe something. And that for me put me in an incredibly difficult psychological position for a very, very long time. Whereas actually now it's not that. In my life, everyone can believe whatever they want, which is that what you do, you decide on a direction based on how something feels to you energetically. You then make a vulnerable step in that direction, opening yourself up, exposing yourself in some way. And then you wait to see where the synchronicities are and what the feedback is. That's faith. You have to see evidence. It's not about perpetually moving in like trying to brute force something, as both you and I did, or moving like in a complete like fantasy world towards some goal that's completely impractical. It is this ongoing dialogue with reality, which was that the right move? That's what the teal or the turquoise leader looks like, where you move, you're like, okay, was that the right thing? Is anything going on? Is there any synchronicity? Nothing. Okay, cool. Well, maybe I need to go in a different direction. Or if the door does open, often it opens in a completely orthogonal place. Like, oh shit, an opportunity opened over there. I wasn't expecting that. Then you move towards that, right? It's this very dynamic way of acting in relationship with the world, which unfortunately most modern structures don't allow. And you could argue that's kind of unfair, or you could argue that the modern structures exist to allow us to learn, right? If we operated in this state of total freedom and lack of restriction all the time, we wouldn't really learn anything. But reality and the nature of materialism and money is set up in such a way right now to provide a perfect example for us to really test that thesis. A lot of people I'm around have a very strong conceptual belief in everything that we've just talked about. And yet, when it comes to making a leap that puts their entire family at risk financially, it is a very difficult proposition, and it's completely different, right? And so, like that I feel is like what we're being initiated into as a culture right now.
What I like about this is that it's testable. If what we're talking about here is true, then this is testable. You don't have to believe in a certain doctrine. You can basically go, okay, what should happen is if I pay attention, I should be getting some kind of a signal. And if I follow the signal, there should be confirmation that I'm on the right path. There should be signs to tell me I'm not on the right path. And what would you suggest if someone's hearing this and going, okay, well, I want to try this out for myself? What's the starting point? How does one test this idea for oneself?
Yeah, I think there's really tangible ways of doing it. Entirely different topic of conversation, but I believe that a lot of people get left brain locked, which is where they get stuck in their brain's left hemisphere, which really abstracts them away from any of the kind of intuitive guidance that they need in order to get themselves unstuck when in very difficult, like static, like stale life positions. So I spent all of last year researching ways of becoming more right hemispheric. Now, within the context of the question you just asked, I've increasingly come to believe that the energetic gradient of our lives is probably like the most important way of navigating. That basically, so one of my favorite thinkers is a woman, a neuroscientist called Dr. Anne-Laure Lecomte, and she talks about these twin things: one, becoming an anthropologist of your own life, and two, tiny experiments. And the anthropologist of your own life is corroborated by one of the best transformational coaches I know, a guy called Devin Martin, where basically for at least 2 weeks, but I would argue that people are stuck to do longer, to basically watch what you do every day, watch who you speak to, How do you feel after speaking to them? Do you feel drained or do you feel energized? When you're reading about a certain topic, do you feel drained or do you feel energized? And then I think you have to vary your routine within those few weeks. Like if you're stuck, it's unlikely that you're going to find the salvation on the way out. So vary your routine, try different things, meet different people, just explore a little bit more. And then when you've calibrated to something energetic, create an experiment. I'll give you a tangible example. A guy I knew was a COO of a hedge fund, hated it, was a writer, always wanted to write, didn't feel he would get supported by writing. And I met with him and he wrote a Wall Street newsletter. And the next day, after I met him, I said, listen, my favorite quote is, if you follow your bliss, doors will open where there were only walls. What can you do to do that? And he said, I'm a writer, but usually I just write about Wall Street stuff. And I was like, well, what else you got? He's like, actually, I write short stories. I was like, well, tomorrow put one of your short stories in your newsletter. He's a brilliant writer. The next day he put one of his short stories in his newsletter. And the first person to write back was Andrew Bless, someone he didn't even know was on his distribution list, just saying, I really like this. And he kept writing. He's now published his first book. He lives a life of really enjoyable flow, and he took that one step out based on something that was energetically very obvious to him, but had no immediate logical payoff. Moving from the CEO of a hedge fund to being a writer is not straightforward, and you have to have that degree of faith, and you have to believe those synchronicities as they come through. So you have to, one, understand what the energetic sensitivity is. Two, you have to formulate an experiment. And three, you then have to judge that experiment by the standards of synchronicity, or just feedback. Maybe you do something, you get $1 million straight back. You're like, well, that was pretty strong feedback. Maybe you get 100,000 clicks. That was strong feedback. Like I on leaving my last job, I got offered to do a 5-minute slot at one of Wall Street's most prestigious conferences out of nowhere, only when I decided I was definitively leaving my job, which is pretty funny, right? Like that was the coincidence I was talking about. It got 1 million impressions, right? Like it was a full breakout moment for me. And it was just an immediate feedback loop with me deciding to make the decision that I thought was the right one. So that is how you implement it. Unfortunately, the experiments are different for everyone. The energetic gradient is different for everyone. Most of my examples revolve around writing because that's what my life is. But I know examples around coding, around cooking. It's different for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that is very much a feature of it. This is also something I had to learn. There's some areas in my life where I don't trust myself, and I was always trying to defer to other people. I was always I'm going to do this like someone else tells me to, and it just kept not working. And so it's like I really had to be like, no, I have to find my own way to do this. That's a feature, and that can be very unpleasant because we love the idea. Well, I'm just going to follow a recipe that's proven, right? But I think that's very much a feature of this. Also, one of the things I find consistently to be true is that the amount of fear that we feel before doing it is often directly proportional to how big the breakthrough is from doing it. So it's the kind of thing where, if I have this impulse, like, okay, I want to share my short story in my newsletter, it probably also comes with oh my God, no, people are going to hate this, they're going to unsubscribe, there's going to be this irrational fear, and overcoming that fear is basically, the bigger that step feels, the more likely it is that essentially I'm going in the right direction. There's always this resistance, there's always this, it's almost like pushing through a wall of resistance. And I think that's important to not mix those two up, right? There's kind of an intuitive sense of this is what I feel called to do, and I'm super scared of doing it.
I think there's a reason. It goes back to the video game thing about the biggest bosses dropping the biggest power-ups.
Yeah.
Being one of the things you'll say is you don't have to fight all the dragons, you only have to fight the dragons in your way. And one of the coaches that I found very influential in our community, he has a framework. He's called Brian Wetton. There's a framework called Yes, Yes, Hell No, which is, does rationality support this choice? Yes. Does intuition support this choice? Yes. Does fear say hell no? That's probably the right direction. And the way that I interpret the reason why, and often, by the way, that's really helpful for people that don't know what they're interested in. If you don't have that strong enough connection to that attractor in your life, you at least know what you want to get away from, which is helpful. Yeah. But I think everything we've been talking about comes down to connection with source, that connection with ultimate reality, that connection with non-local consciousness. And typically we're afraid of that really direct connection because it can really hurt, right? By opening ourselves up to the world, we're allowing ourselves to get really, really hurt, right? And so when we offer something that's genuinely, authentically ours, like people don't get worried about getting rejected for their Excel skills, in my experience, right? If you get rejected from a job for your Excel skills, you're like, cool. But if you publish something that really has your entire soul wrapped up in it, and then everyone's like, that's a piece of shit, they're saying you're a piece of shit. And that is terrifying. But what I've noticed almost universally, well, no, universally, is that when people offer something like that from a place of authenticity, amazing things happen. And one of my favorite expressions is love is mutually accelerating disclosure. There's something about the universe that whenever I write a piece that's really raw, but with a desire to help other people who are in terrible situations, something incredible happens in terms of a synchronicity, or I meet someone amazing. And it just every time.
Yeah. There's something about doing the work that you feel is like almost like too much. Right? Because I have this as well, where my previous business, and the thing I'm most well known for is basically a software startup. And there was definitely it was so much easier to, let's say, make content or give interviews or whatever talking about this software business, because it wasn't a fragment of my soul.
Yeah.
Right? It's just this business. And I definitely feel like the work I've been doing, which is essentially teaching the life skills that I think are the most important ones, and which is much more like a me bearing my true soul, is so much harder to do. There's so much more resistance, so much more difficult to get through. And also, what I've especially experienced in person when I give workshops or retreats or something, there's a feeling of like effortlessness to it, and the feedback I get from people is, yes, this is definitely what you should be doing with your life, right? So it's interesting that, exactly as you say, it's just the more it feels like you're bearing your soul, the scarier it is, and the more you're on the right path.
I want to make a distinction, because it was one of the bigger mistakes that I made, of a lot of mistakes, was that I felt for the manifestation of that life path that you're talking about, I had to reject the Excel skills. And that was a colossal mistake. But basically, like if you think about the kind of the rainbow onion thing again, like those skills that you gain at that stage of life need to be integrated into what you're doing later. And they've made you a very unique person in terms of what you can offer to the world. Like when I tried to be a hospice worker, right? Me sitting in a room watching people die, there was nothing about that integrated anything that I was good at. When I tried to be a social worker, there was nothing in that integrated anything that I was good at. And yet, when I went to writing about these issues and talking about these issues to a finance audience, the universe was like, oh, thank God he got it. Oh, thank God he got it. This was what he was supposed to be doing. This is what he wanted to do all along. I get to use all of these skills I spent 20 years honing in finance in service of something that I really care about, in ways that, as you say, are very, very scary a lot of the time. But it's a full integration of my past rather than a rejection of it, which I think was something that screwed me up for a very long time.
Yeah, I love the frame. I think this comes from River Kenna, the frame of like, if you're trying to figure out what to do, look at the path your soul has been walking all along, something like that. And that really made sense to me, because it's one of those things where also, I'm so driven to teach. And if you look at my life, it's like I've been teaching since my teens. I've always found myself in some kind of a teaching position. To me, that is also one of those signals. It's something that I feel drawn to. And then, yes, there's sometimes this hesitation and fear, and oh my God, am I good enough, and so on and so forth. But also, oh, look at that, I've been doing it for 30 years.
Well, I think the hardest part, which again goes back again, hopefully I'm illustrating why I think this is so important. The hardest part of all of this. So there's the slightly wonky scientific definition, right? The way that we're being pulled is towards differentiation and integration. The differentiation is the soul's path that you've been on. Like, look at all these things that you've been trained for without your knowing. Kind of the wax on, wax off Karate Kid thing. Like, you've been doing all these things and suddenly they're going to fit together into a new pattern. Differentiation, what puts you in flow? What is really boring for other people, but you love doing? I think people intrinsically understand that, even if it can be hard for them to connect with it. The integration side is where you have to have a different worldview, which is when you do that in service of love, in service of the evolution of consciousness, you will be rewarded for that choice. by the universe in the form of abundance of some kind, maybe not material, but things will just go okay in the Taoist frame of things when you find that right place to offer it. That's the faith idea. That's the non-local consciousness idea. That's the post-materialism idea, that there is actually a path for you and that path is safe. You will be held along that path. That for me is where everything comes together, which is like, cool, if I do this, will I be able to pay the bills?
Yes.
Right? Will I be respected? Will my wife leave me? Will my children judge me? Like, that is why that if we start to believe we're in a post-materialistic age, we can make those decisions. They'll still be unbelievably scary, but we can then make the step, watch for the evidence, make the step, watch for the evidence, and life becomes increasingly easy. For me, life is increasingly easy is maybe the wrong word. I work really, really hard. I work 7 days a week, but my work feels like play. So it's very hard for me to determine when I'm working, when I'm playing, because I'm doing exactly what I want to do. But that's what the life I've evolved, where like there is no amount of money you would be able to pay me for me to go back into an office.
Yeah, I love that you brought this up. I think this is a really good way to tie things together, because it is the idea that you do not live in a random, uncaring universe where you have to, oh, well, I guess I just am confined to doing Excel for the rest of my life because that's the one monetizable skill that I've managed to develop. It's like, no, there's a purpose to all this, and including maybe your hellish experience of doing Excel for too long and hating it. That is somehow also part of the meaningful journey that you're on, that's supposed to go somewhere. It is not random. I think that is a challenging idea for many people, but I think that is really worth, well, it's really worth experimenting with at the very least.
I think it's the idea that we're all being taught right now. There's this lovely esoteric idea that we can manifest with our thoughts, right? And
Yeah.
there's some degree to which that is true. Like, look at the placebo effect. But one of the arguments you hear made in a lot of new age circles is that we're evolving into a new kind of human, and later in that process we'll be able to manifest much more precisely and immediately with our thoughts. But we could do that right now at the level of consciousness we're at. It would be like handing an Uzi to a toddler, right? That we'd be constantly navigating Lamborghinis everywhere, and like it would be total chaos.
Yeah.
So what we've been given is a really low latency, low power degree of manifestation. But we're taught constantly that if you manifest out of fear and scarcity, everything goes wrong. And if you manifest out of love and abundance, everything goes right. And what this mid-career, midlife crisis aspect is about is like, dude, so you've been manifesting from fear and scarcity for a little while now. How's that working out for you? You happy? Are you thriving? Okay, now let's see if you can manifest from love and see how things go. And it always goes well, right? Like if you get the right choice, which is a big if, it always goes well. But that is the initiation. I think that it's a positive reframe of like, people can see this whole materialist paradigm as being like a prison, right? Like a matrix you have to like escape from. And I'm like, maybe this has all been set up by a malevolent demon to trap us from understanding our true nature. But like, even realizing that is a lesson, right? Like, even if you have that framing, which seems like slightly paranoid and crazy, but like, I sometimes think about it. Whereas like, even if this whole system has been set up to trap you, if you start to act like the whole system has been set up to trap you, and live through it in this kind of bodhisattva, productive, creative way, that works. That still works, right? Your worldview's got you to the right place at the end in a slightly more paranoid way, but you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So one other thing I want to touch on, you've already mentioned you have a community of 150 people that you call a wisdom community, and I think this is a really fascinating concept. Can you tell us a little bit about what is a wisdom community? And why did you choose to do this?
Because I couldn't not do it. I tried to avoid doing it for at least a couple of years. Can't remember how many years ago, three or so years ago, I wrote a list of the 21 ideas that have been most influential in my life. Most of them were received in a download moment in one day in October of 2017. And there was this one idea that wasn't related to any of the other ideas, which was Dunbar's number, which is groups of 150 people are basically the hard cognitive limit of how many humans can know each other. Not how many humans can Shane know or Tom know, but how many humans can Shane and Tom and Steve and Mike and Michelle all know together, the most cohesive social group. And then whilst I went out on the road accidentally for 3 years after my crisis and started talking about transitional spaces, I had a couple of hundred people from very senior positions across Wall Street and Silicon Valley reach out to me and be like, "Oh, I'm in a transitional phase too. A lot of these ideas are resonating with me. What do I do about it?" I was like, I don't know. Here's a link to a Brene Brown article. Here's some videos on YouTube. It was like a really crappy answers. And eventually, like my job at a wealth manager just started getting less and less interesting. Like there were some more and more agency frictions with it. And I was like, okay, I'm smart enough to understand that when this happens, I'm being kicked out of the nest for very benevolent reasons. It may feel annoying, but it's for very benevolent reasons. And it became obvious to me, even being slapped around the face for several months, that I was being called to start this community. So what we are is we're 150 people. We're probably 30% capital markets, 50% founders, and 20% like intuitives, neuroscientists, healers, weirdos. And we come together and we explore all of the issues that you and I have been talking about within a container of high discernment. That these guys have real jobs. You know, they've sold companies, they founded companies, they run hedge funds. They're smart and they want some science with their woo. But we also experiment with practices. You know, breath work seems to work for a lot of people. Internal family systems seems to work for a lot of people. Some energy healing, hey, maybe that works. Who do we trust? Who are we going to use? Meditation, that seems to work for a lot of people. How should we go about it? How do we do it safely? All these things, there seems to be no aggregated answers. There's lots of individual practitioners who will convince you that their modality is the best modality and there's only one way of doing it. But there's very few mechanisms for everyone to try it together. And I realized a few weeks ago that it's super simple. I just connect people who are a little bit less alive than they want to be to content, people, and practices that bring them a little bit more alive, raise their energy level. And that raised energy level is itself transformational. So, like, that's all we've done. And all the community aims at is personal evolution, which sounds selfish until you realize that personal evolution, if done right, always ends up in service of the whole.
Nice. Yeah. I think it's also a beautiful example where it's like you didn't set out with a business plan and do that. It was just like you got nudges that, hey, this is needed. And I think it's a great idea. I love the idea of high discernment and capping it at 150 people. I think that is an amazing way to avoid a lot of the problems that come with just typically, right, someone starts a community or something and it's just growth. More is better. And then that leads to all kinds of problems that I think it's genius to really put a cap on it right away. I love the idea, and I love the idea of more wisdom communities. Right? It's like it's kind of anti-fragile to have all these individual pods instead of everyone piling onto Facebook and getting upset about the latest thing.
I don't get it, man. Like, I don't get it. Interviewed however many hundreds of people about leading edge, since I started it. These are really impressive dudes and dudettes, right? Like, and they're like, why aren't there 1,000 of these? And I'm like, honest, I've got no idea. I've only found less than 4, right? That I think are in like equivalent to us. And I don't know what I don't know, but like I see capacity for thousands of these. And then I see capacity for them to interface with each other, with capital and practitioners and real estate and content and what practices work interfacing between them all. So you have these really tight Dunbar communities coming together. And I think one of the great bottlenecks is going to be finding people to run these communities. But like, with an affluent community, you could clear $500,000 a year just from membership fees, right? Like, you can probably at least make 150, right, for charging people, like $100 a month, which is a reasonable amount of money for the value you can get from these communities. It's a good income for someone that wants to be the steward, and it's dramatically less stressful than being a one-to-one coach, which is, I don't think people understand, a very, very, very hard living. So yeah, the mismatch here is very weird to me, and I can't scale leading edge. I don't want to scale leading edge. So I feel like I can say this with a high degree of integrity where I'm like, guys, this is going to explode. Get moving. Like everyone get moving like this. If you want to make a living and change the world, like this is a way to do it. That has me very, very confident.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you're just ahead of your time. I would not be surprised to see more and more of this. And I hope we see more of this because I'm convinced that this kind of decentralized way, instead of everyone piling onto one thing, I think that is the future. So hopefully a lot more of this. And thank you so much for the pioneering work you're doing.
Thank you.
Tom,
I didn't want to
you didn't, yeah, but here you are. Tom, where can people go to learn more from you?
Probably the best place is my Substack, The Leading Edge, and I have a website, theleading-edge.org. The other one's a Jewish community project. That isn't me. And then I'm on Twitter at Tom Owen Morgan. But I try and answer every DM. I try and meet as many people that want to meet me. It's what I do now, and it's really fun. So please come find me.
Okay, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Shay. Thanks for having me.
That concludes my conversation with Tom. I hope you found this eye-opening and fascinating. Like I mentioned at the beginning, in the description, in the show notes for this episode, there's loads of links. You can find Tom's work there, and I've also linked to all of the other resources and people that he touched on and recommended during this conversation. And I would love to hear from you. Is there an idea here that really stuck out? Is there something that you are going to try in your own life inspired by this conversation? Let me know by leaving a comment below. That's all for this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.